Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly fascinating piece of historical courtroom drama. Imagine a world where the rigid, predictable rules of international commerce just snap. That is exactly what happens when the globe literally goes to war. We are looking at the landmark legal case of Jebara versus Ottoman Bank. It's an incredible story about early global trade, the sudden, paralyzing chaos of World War I, and a massive legal question regarding the precise limits of agency during an unprecedented crisis. When nations go to war and international communication goes completely dark overnight, who is legally responsible for the money left sitting in the vault? Well, let's find out.
Section 1. Trade before the war.
So, to really understand the legal fallout of this case, we first need to get a handle on the machinery of early 20th century commerce. Enter our principal figure, Jebara. He's a British merchant operating out of Manchester, England, and he had a pretty straightforward cross-border business model. He procured goods and shipped them overseas to buyers in Beirut. Now, to pay for these shipments, the Beirut buyers didn't just load cash onto a returning boat. Instead, they utilized the sophisticated international banking system of the time. They would pay the local Beirut branch of the Ottoman Bank in their local currency, piastras, to cover what are known as bills of exchange. Meanwhile, Jebara, back in Manchester where the Ottoman Bank also had a branch, expected to ultimately receive the equivalent of those funds in British pounds. It was a well-oiled machine. It was built entirely on predictability, reliable communication, and the steady flow of international banking.
Section 2. World War I severs the connection. Now, this standard business timeline was entirely dependent on global stability. The goods arrive in Beirut exactly as planned, and the buyers execute their end of the contract by handing over their local piastras to the bank branch. And then, August 1914 arrives. World War I erupts across the globe. And listen, this wasn't just a massive geopolitical crisis. It was an immediate and catastrophic logistical paralysis. International mail routes, telegraph lines, virtually all reliable forms of communication between Beirut and England were severed practically overnight. The transaction was frozen in time, trapped right in the middle of its execution, with the communication lines it relied on completely cut off.
Section 3. Funds trapped in Beirut.
When the music stopped, the involved parties found themselves in vastly different and legally complicated positions. The buyers in Beirut were actually quite fortunate. They had already successfully received their physical goods before the borders shut down. The Beirut branch of the Ottoman Bank, which was functioning exactly as an intermediary should up to that point, was now just sitting on a pile of local piasters. But Jebara, back in England, was left entirely empty-handed. Because of the total halt in international communication and transportation, the bank was practically and legally unable to execute the final leg of the transaction to send the British pound equivalent. Jebara was owed his money, and the bank was stuck holding a bag of foreign currency they couldn't move.
Section 4. An agent of necessity? This unprecedented stalemate forced a really profound, complex legal question into the courtroom. The money couldn't move, right? The bank physically held it in their vaults. So, by virtue of possessing this money during a global emergency, did the bank legally transform into an agent of necessity for Jebara? This right here is the absolute core of the dispute. It bridges the gap between passive possession and active legal duty.
To fully understand the gravity of Jebara's claim, we have to look at what an agent of necessity actually is in the eyes of the law. Historically, this legal doctrine arose primarily in maritime law. Imagine a ship captain carrying a cargo of perishable goods like, say, tomatoes. If a terrible storm delays the ship and the tomatoes start to rot, the captain becomes an agent of necessity. The law grants the captain the power to sell those goods at the nearest port without asking the owner, just to save the value of the cargo from total ruin. Well, Jebara argued this exact same principle should apply to international banking. He claimed that because the bank held his money during the extreme emergency of a world war, they automatically assumed this elevated duty of care and owed him the strict responsibilities of an agent. It's a clever and super compelling argument. I mean, if disaster strikes while you hold my property, aren't you legally bound to step up and actively protect my interests?
Section 5. The court's final ruling.
The court firmly and definitively rejected Jebara's argument, establishing a critical boundary in commercial law. Possession alone does not equal an agency of necessity. The judge ruled that merely holding another person's property during a crisis makes you at most a custodian or a bailee, but it definitely does not automatically elevate your status to that of an agent. You see, an agent actively acts on someone's behalf with specific legal authority. The bank, in this scenario, was entirely passive.
It's a strict boundary line drawn by the legal system, meticulously separating a mere factual circumstance from an actual binding legal obligation.
The court's reasoning hinged heavily on the nature of the property itself and the concept of consent. They stated explicitly that a party, in this case the Ottoman Bank, cannot legally become an agent of necessity simply by taking charge of someone else's property uninvited. Unlike a rotting cargo of tomatoes that requires immediate physical intervention to preserve its value, money sitting securely in a bank vault does not perish. The bank didn't ask to be trapped by a world war, and no immediate action was strictly necessary to save the physical piastres from destruction. They didn't actively step into the shoes of an agent, they were merely caught holding the bag when the lines went dark.
The precedent set here is absolutely foundational for contract and commercial law. First, the court recognized that the Ottoman Bank merely possessed the currency. Possession is a factual circumstance. It's not a legal mandate. Second, because no action was required to save the asset from physical ruin, they did not legally assume an agent's active role. They were a bank branch holding currency, nothing more. And third, establishing the ultimate legal takeaway of the case. Uninvited possession, even in the dramatic shadow of global warfare, does not conjure an agency relationship out of thin air. The severe wartime emergency did not magically rewrite the strict boundaries of their commercial agreement.
The chaos of World War I proved that sudden, catastrophic disruptions don't automatically transform passive custodians into active agents. The boundaries of legal agency require much more than just a crisis. So I leave you with this thought. If holding a client's funds during the sudden outbreak of a literal world war isn't enough to make a bank your agent of necessity, what specific, invited actions must a financial institution take today to finally cross that line into true legal responsibility? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the legal foundations of the world around you.